Are you ready up there, Amanda? Okay, I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening. Well, we are so glad that each of y'all have decided to join us this evening. We're so thankful to have Dr. Westers with us, not just here this evening, but with our community. He'll be speaking to our youth tomorrow evening at a special service from 6 to 8:30. So if you have any youth or friends that have youth, please invite them to that tomorrow. They're going to have a hot dogs, food, and a dodgeball tournament. So before Dr. Westers speaks, so we're looking forward to that event tomorrow evening. Will you bow your head, and we're just going to open with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, I just thank you for this evening, this day that you've created. Lord, we just ask that you would be with Dr. Westers as he speaks. Lord, I just thank you for his calling on his life, Lord, the passion that you've given for his specific field of study and self-harm and adolescence, Lord. And I just pray that you would speak through him, and that your Holy Spirit would bring every word that he says alive and speak to our hearts and minds. Father, I just pray that as he speaks this evening to the youth tomorrow and to the teachers on Wednesday, Lord, that again, you would just speak and bring revelation, that you would equip each one of us, Lord, not only youth with tools for themselves and their friends, but also parents, grandparents, Lord, that we would just be equipped as we run into youth that need help and that need you. Father, thank you. We give you all glory, honor, and praise. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. Well, I just want to introduce Dr. Nicholas Westers is a clinical psychologist at Children's Health, and he's also an associate professor of psychiatry at UT Southwestern Medical Center in Dallas. He's a board certified in clinical child and adolescent psychology and serves as chair of the Media and Communications Committee of the International Society for the Study of Self-Injury. His clinical and research interests focus on adolescent non-suicidal self-injury, depression, suicide, and high-risk behavior, and he is the host and producer of the Psychology of Self-Injury podcast, a resource for parents, professionals, and people with lived experience of self-injury. We have a table full of resources out in the hallway that you're welcome to pick up on your way out, or in the foyer. It also has a link to Dr. Westers' podcast, which is very informational if you haven't had a chance to listen to that. Will you join me in welcoming Dr. Nicholas Westers?
Well, thank you, and I am very humbled to be here. Thank you for having me, my wife and I, and our son in the back row there. We drove here from Dallas this morning and to the afternoon, and to be able to talk about, obviously, a topic I'm passionate about, and not knowing who's going to come, from the community, who even has heard of it. I know it was advertised in the newspaper, and it's a tough topic, and I always like to mention that for me it's my everyday, but for a lot of people it's not, and so I always want to preface this this could be heavy information. I know we have a lot of young people in the room, so hopefully parents and family members you can debrief your child after, explain anything, because it can be a heavy topic. And without disclosing necessarily any names or how many people in this room either actually know someone who has self-injured, whether it's themselves, family member, or anyone else? Who I'm trying to figure out who I'm talking to. So most people in here have known someone who's self-injured, and that makes sense because we know from data throughout the world that 1 in 5 young people, teenagers, have self-injured at some point in their life, and then really about 1 in 13 young adults, and we're talking 13% of college-age students, and then 6% of adults. So so looking at the numbers in here, I always want to be mindful of who I'm talking to, knowing the likelihood of someone with a history of the behavior that's in here. So to give a preface, we'll spoil a little bit. I don't know who's going to be at the youth event tomorrow, but how I got interested in this topic was I was a sophomore in college at Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and a couple of friends from my sister dorm wing that were freshmen came up to me for whatever reason, because I was a psychology major maybe, but we were also friends. They disclosed to me they had been cutting, and I had no idea what to do. Sophomore, and when you get a bachelor's degree in psychology, anyone that is looking into doing that right now, maybe you're on your that journey. You can't really do much with a bachelor's degree, just FYI. And it makes sense once you go to graduate school why you can't, because you learn so much more in graduate school. So here I am, a sophomore, not really knowing what to do, and I was like, let me write my senior research paper on this topic. So I go and I start researching. There's like nothing out there on this, and I mean this is well over 20 years ago now, and so there's a lot has changed. A lot has changed over time, and I'm going to talk about in a little bit. But I decided when I went to graduate school, I was going to write my dissertation on this. So I wrote my dissertation titled Forgiveness and Religious Coping in Adolescents Who Self-Injure. And I actually have a couple publications based off of that, and I can talk about the forgiveness piece and religious coping if anyone wants to. I plan to talk for about 30 to 40 minutes. I could literally talk on this topic for hours. I have and I do. So I'm going to try to leave room for question, answers, discussion. Hopefully not too personal questions, because I can't necessarily give specific advice, from as a licensed professional, but I can kind of give general guidance, and hopefully by the end of today you'll have some ideas of where I'm coming from. But yeah, this is the podcast that I, during the pandemic, really researched how to create a podcast, because I looked and there's just nothing out there on resources for self-injury in the podcast world, and podcasts are hot right now. So I was like, let me just put this together. I have access to the leading experts in the field as part of the International Society for the Study of Self-Injury. So we're in our third season. I just released episode 39 on Friday. And so it's a really good resource, I think, with, of course, I'm a little biased, but interviewing some of these experts, I'm learning. I'm constantly re-listening to episodes, so I'm keep it afresh, a lot of the knowledge. But the ones in the boxes here, I think that parents and family members will be of particular interest, especially when it comes to parenting young people who self-injure. We interviewed a friend of mine and his daughter, she's a young adult, 21-year-old, self-injures, and so that's really powerful episode, I think. And there's the ones in red are ones that are to come pretty soon. But before we kind of dive in, I feel like it's important, whatever audience I'm talking to make sure we're all on the same page. And what I mean by self-injury, which I use interchangeably with the term non-suicidal self-injury, or NSSI for short. It's really purposely inflicting injury upon oneself that's done without, that results in immediate tissue damage done without suicidal intent, not socially sanctioned within one's culture, nor for display. So tattoos we don't consider those self-injury. Even if people intentionally go to get tattoos to experience the pain and to cause damage to their skin, it's culturally appropriate. We don't consider that non-suicidal self-injury. But I do always like to differentiate it from self-harm, which is the colloquial term, meaning the everyday use in the community. We will often use the self-harm, but really self-harm is an umbrella category under which is non-suicidal self-injury, suicide, of course, disordered eating behavior, substance use, and other risky behaviors. So self-harm is really an umbrella category. And the other thing I like to differentiate it is atypical severe self-injury. So back when I first started researching this, when I was in college, people were using the term self-mutilation, which is very provocative, very intense word that doesn't even really effectively capture the behavior itself. People aren't mutilating themselves. If we fall down and scratch ourselves or cut ourselves, we don't say the floor mutilated me, or I got mutilated by, we say we got cut by it or injured by it. And it's an outdated term, but people were using that. And I think it was really because they just didn't know what to do with it, and they were really put off by the topic. And so for me, it's kind of a stigma-heavy term. So we don't use that in the field anymore. And then I'm not talking about stereotypic self-injury either, which that means repetitive type of self-injury we often see with individuals with intellectual disorders or disabilities or autism spectrum disorders, although people on those spectrums can engage in non-suicidal self-injury and or engage in stereotypic self-injury. For the purposes of today, we're not talking about the stereotypic repetitive type self-injury, the head bangings and those kind of behaviors. Okay, we're sticking with some of the heavy stuff too right now. I always like to differentiate, because there's a whole group and researchers in the United Kingdom who they don't differentiate between suicide and non-suicidal self-injury. They treat it as the same behavior, but talk to anyone who self-injures, most of the time they're like, I'm not trying to kill myself. I'm just trying to find relief. And so I like to kind of differentiate the two behaviors. So for suicide, typically the intent is to die, or at least there's some intent to either die or at least end consciousness or emotional suffering, whereas self-injury, there's typically the desire to feel alive, to be able to cope with life, and sometimes even avoid acting on suicidal thoughts or or engaging in suicidal behavior. And then for people who attempt suicide, they typically feel hopeless and helpless afterward and feel no better after an attempt. Of course, for those who have completed and have died by suicide, we don't know for sure. Sometimes they try, they do it to end that suffering, but obviously we don't know from an internal perspective if that relief is really still there. But those who self-injure may experience periods of hope, and they typically experience relief after the act. Interestingly, we find in research it's about 15 to 20 minutes in length on average that there's a relief, and then like a lot of the uncomfortable and pleasant emotions return, unfortunately, shortly after that, but it's an immediate relief typically. And then for those who attempt suicide, usually it's one method that they do, and it's different from the very method that they use to self-injure if they also engage in self-injury. And people who self-injure typically use more than one method, but it's different than what they use to attempt suicide. And then, of course, for suicide attempts, they're very lethal typically and require medical attention, whereas for self-injury, sometimes they do, but for the most part, most often, they're not lethal at all. They rarely require medical attention, but sometimes they do. But those are kind of like an easy way to kind of like separate the two behaviors that I'm only focusing on non-suicidal self-injury today. Still a tough topic, I know. And if we think about the reasons why, ask anyone, why they self-injure, and actually I'm going to give, maybe a strategy how to do that, not necessarily say, why would you do this to yourself? That's a what not to do, by the way, a little nugget in advance. Don't ever, don't do that. There are ways to ask them, what does it do to help you? And what ways does self-injuring help you? Because obviously you're doing it for a reason multiple times. All our behaviors serve functions, so there's a reason that, most likely that you're doing it. So when we ask this question, most often it's to cope with intense, unpleasant emotions, and sometimes they can be positive, like happy emotions. That's like just any type of emotion is felt with like as a threat or just very great discomfort, and so self-injuring can sometimes provide immediate relief from that. So most commonly, it's to find emotional relief. Sometimes it's also to end like feelings of numbness, because sometimes people, especially with depression, just feel like numb, empty, and so self-injuring can help make them feel alive. And then sometimes it's to communicate with others or get attention. Now, interestingly, people, physicians, psychologists, therapists, parents, caregivers, community members, most often, if we ask them, why do people self-injure? They often think it's a cry for help or a way to get attention. Interestingly, if we look at the research, that's one of the least commonly endorsed reasons for actually self-injuring, but one of the most commonly believed reasons that people self-injure. And I think this gets it a little tricky too, because when we say to people, come to me for help, instead of self-injuring, and then they do self-injure, and then they get attention. They're like, you're just doing this to get attention. It's like, well, which is it? Like, if I self-injure, is it for attention, or do I come to you and when I'm tempted and I have an urge, and then you call me like attention-seeking, and so for this behavior. So it can be like a double bind, and it's not really fair for the individual. And usually I like to reframe that. Well, one, if an individual has to self-injure in order to get attention, like what in the world is going on in their environment, in their relationships, that they're not getting attention, that they would go to such a, to such a behavior to get attention. So let's go ahead and give them attention with empathy, of course. Another way I like to do is just reframe it as like, what are they trying to communicate? What resources in their community are they trying to activate? And sometimes that's what people will self-injure. But again, I am talking a lot about self-injuring to get attention, and yet that's one of the least common reasons people do engage in the behavior. And then lastly, sometimes they'll self-injure to avoid responsibility or an unwanted experience. And one more comment on these interpersonal social reasons is that we find that many times individuals who do start self-injuring this way, the function of the behavior can shift over time. It often shifts to self-injuring later for emotional reasons, because maybe when they self-injure for the first time, it worked for them, even if it was to communicate with others or get it, I'm putting in quotation marks, to get attention. And then they realize it helps them regulate their emotions. And so then it shifts and becomes an intrapersonal, within the person, an emotional reason for self-injuring. And then there's that last part with the asterisk, the self-punishment, because that's related to my research and my dissertation, which doesn't really fit exactly into these categories, but I'm going to touch on that here. And this is where I want to kind of like spend most of today talking, and with the time that we have. So a lot of you raise your hand that you know someone, or have a friend, or someone that you care about who self-injures, and it makes sense that you're here to hear about this topic. And I'll be honest, I'm constantly learning. Obviously, this is my area of focus, expertise, and I'm constantly learning from people who self-injure, and you'll hear that on the podcast. I interview people with lived experience of self-injury, and I'm constantly learning, including this first point. Many times, an individual has been self-injuring for a long time, maybe for a year, 2 years, and then we find out as friends, family, caregivers, and then suddenly it's like, oh, whoa, what do we do? What do we do? And then we go into overdrive of trying to protect that person, lock away the sharps, all those objects, and get them help. But I think it's helpful sometimes to remember how long they've been self-injuring and how they've used this as a coping strategy versus how long we've actually known about the behavior. So as a caregiver and parent, caregiver, friend, loved one, it's pretty scary. We want to help them stop immediately, right? Well, for the person who's self-injuring, oftentimes they've been doing it for a long time, and it's not that big a deal in their mind. And so to overreact can actually make them feel less safe to talk about it. So I think it's helpful to keep in mind. So I've only known you've been self-injuring for a week, but you've been doing it for a year. So keeping that in mind. And then number 2, urges versus behaviors. Typically, we only see the effects of the time that the person has engaged in the behavior and given into the urge. We don't see them many times, perhaps hundreds of times, that they have had the urge to self-injure and didn't. We only see the times in which they did. And so if we focus so much on the behavior, by the way, we're talking about self-injury, but when it comes to the person, we don't want to focus so much on the behavior that we miss the person. And so they may have had many urges that they have successfully resisted, and it's been really hard for them. And then the one time that they might give in to an urge, that might be the time their parent, caregiver, has a negative reaction. It's just like, you're only looking at the times that I've injured. You haven't even recognized all the times that I haven't when I've been tempted to. So I think that's always something to keep in mind, like urges versus behaviors. And then this huge thing, and actually this is relevant to Wednesday when I'm speaking at the schools about covering up. So in past school protocols, there's been the issue of making sure that people cover up their scars from when they self-injure. I disagree with that. Fresh wounds that are open, yes, we want to make sure we are covering those up, providing proper medical care, bandages, whatever we need to do to prevent infection, as well as spreading bloodborne pathogens. So it's more for health-related reasons. But for scars, that gets really tricky. And I actually ended up doing an entire episode for the podcast on the psychology of self-injury scarring, because many people have scars. A lot of people don't, but many people who've been self-injuring for a long time, or even just a few times, have significant scarring from their self-injury. And there's nothing to do that can change that. Sometimes people get tattoos. I've known to get tattoos over the scars, 1, to cover them, and 2, to prevent them from acting on any urges so they won't mess up their tattoos. But as far as covering up, wearing long sleeves and long pants, that's one thing that I often look for. It was 103 degrees today or hotter, and I'm still kind of sweating from earlier. But when I have a young person come into my office and it's Texas heat, and they're wearing a hoodie or long sleeve shirts and long pants, and it's been a while since they have, but I know they have a history of self-injury. In my mind, many times that's kind of like a little hint that they've had a rough week and that they may have given into an urge to self-injure. And I'll usually just ask about that, with respectful curiosity. But to ask someone to cover up scars is similar to asking them to cover up a part of who they are that they can't change. And so I know some parents and caregivers, family members with good intentions have said, people are going to see you for a job interview, and that's going to affect that. People are going to ask, or it's going to affect your future in some ways. And perhaps sometimes the person hasn't thought of this, but for the most part, there's a complicated relationship with the scars. They're not usually proud of them. Sometimes for those who do have scars, it reminds them of, in a positive way, of all that they've overcome. And if you listen to the episode when a friend of ours who is the father of the young woman who self-injures, he says that scars are a sign that there's been trauma, but there's also healing. And so I think that's really important that we don't just shame someone for the scars that they have. but recognize that, yes, that may be a reminder of them for all that they've overcome, but for most people who self-injure, it's a reminder about unpleasant experiences, times that they've actually given into urges. And so we don't want to sit there and blame them or tell them to cover up because you're embarrassing me with your scars. I don't want people asking questions, when in fact, maybe that's where they've been at for a while, and finally they have the courage, and they're in a spot in their recovery journey that they're willing to go wear short sleeves or go to the pool or to the beach in their swimming suit, and they're being shamed for now doing that when it's part of their recovery journey. They never would have thought about it, and it's a big step for them. And so when I'm talking to young people who self-injure and their scars, I explore to them, what it means, the meaning to them, the meaning that they give to them, as well as the response and reaction that other people have toward them. Point number 4, redefining success. I think about none of us is very good at accomplishing the goals that other people set for us, unless they're in line with our own goals. But most young people, if we're talking about young people, just most people in general know that their parents are not going to be happy with them having self-injured. We just know that. So to say, oh, I can't believe you do this, like, they know you don't, you're not going to approve of it. If anything, for health reasons, right? For breaking of the skin, possibility of infection, keloid scarring, like the big, significant scars. But to ask them to immediately stop, if they've been doing this and it's their coping strategy, like whatever coping strategy you use, maybe you go for a walk, you read, go for a swim, you might smoke, you might drink alcohol, you might, like whatever stress, like if we can have empathy and realize like, hey, this is not, if it was easy to stop, they probably would have done it by now. Like, because they know people, it's not socially acceptable typically. So if we talk about redefining success, we typically want the other person to stop self-injuring immediately, especially as caregivers. Like if you don't stop, I don't trust you to go to camp, or you can't go on this trip. I actually just had a conversation last week on this past week. A few days ago, I was like, after months of not having self-injured, suddenly, because this young person is nervous about going on this trip, they self-injure to cope with those emotions, and then suddenly the parent is saying, no, now you can't go. So when it comes to redefining success, maybe it's not so much how many episodes or how many times they've given into the behavior, but it's making room for those, what we call lapses instead of relapses. It's perfectly appropriate. If this is a habitual coping strategy that works to regulate emotions, and from neuroscience, we know that this is the case. There can be not necessarily like a chemical addiction, but there is this reinforcement of this emotional distress, and then to self-injure that releases that tension, and it reinforces the likelihood of occurring again. But if we can redefine success as maybe instead of you having, you didn't give in to your self-injury right away, you waited 60 seconds, or you came and talked to me as your mother, your father, your friend, your cousin, your brother or sister first. I think that's a huge step in the right direction. And I think too about redefining success and just reframing like regular goals in life. I don't know how many of you in this room have asked someone out, a girl, like if you've asked a girl out, if you asked a boy out. Many times I'm talking to young people, and I remember, like being single, like how nervous it is to ask someone out. And sometimes I just wouldn't, right? Sometimes people are just like, no, because then they'll say no. It's like, that's always the risk, right? So what if the goal isn't for them to say yes, but the goal is to simply have the guts to ask the person out? If they say yes, that's icing on the cake. If they say no, disappointing, but the goal wasn't to get them to say yes, but it was simply to grow as a person, to have the guts to ask someone out. That's reframing that kind of goal. So when it comes to self-injury, reframing a self-injurious episode is like maybe you stuck with it for 5 minutes and you didn't self-injure, and then you did. But the goal was to go 5 minutes without self-injuring, and you did. Yes, you gave into the urge and you self-injured 5 minutes later, but the goal wasn't to stop self-injuring. It was to see if you could go 5 minutes without. If you didn't, that's icing on the cake. If you did, it's disappointing, but the goal wasn't to resist the urge completely, just to go for 5 minutes. That's what I mean by redefining success in that case, and differentiating between lapse and a relapse. A lapse we talk about in depression research being like a return, like a full return of symptoms. Versus a lapse, we have a bad day, we have a bad weekend, and we have some symptoms that come up here and there, but it's just a temporary thing. It's not a full relapse. So it's just because someone hasn't self-injured and they suddenly do after months doesn't mean that they've had a full relapse. If anything, to me, that's impressive. Like, wow, you've gone 6 months and you haven't self-injured. Let's celebrate that. We can expect to have these reoccurrences here and there, but you've gone so long. So that's what I mean by redefining success. Punishment versus consequence. This is kind of a twofer. On the previous slide, you saw that sometimes people self-injure to punish themselves. Not all, but sometimes people do. In fact, my dissertation research I had referenced earlier, I looked at forgiveness among adolescents specifically with a history of self-injury and found that there was no relationship between their self-injury and their ability to forgive other people. In fact, they're really empathic, really kind people. Most of the time, many times they just feel guilty of taking up space on our earth. And those who self-injured more frequently had lower levels of self-forgiveness. So they beat themselves up a lot, even if it's just a perceived transgression, not even like a real sin or error or mistake. They're just so hard on themselves. And so they feel like they deserve punishment and they bestow it upon themselves. And then it's heartbreaking when parents turn around and punish their child for having punished themselves, although they don't know that they self-injured because they punished themselves because they haven't asked the question. They just don't like the behavior, and so like you cut, so now you're not going on this trip. You bit yourself, you burned yourself. Now you can't spend time with your friends. You can't go on the camping trip this weekend with your friends. You're grounded for the next week. You can't play on your PlayStation. And it's like, whoa. Now, a lot of people, though, of course, there's natural consequences, of course. Like if someone self-injures, it's going to take time to, we're going to take care of the wound. You self-injured too deeply. Now we have to go to urgent care to get, medical, provision. And now that means we can't do what we had planned tonight because we're busy taking care of the wound. That's kind of a natural consequence. But many caregivers are also afraid of implementing a consequence because what if I take away their phone or say they can't have their phone, after 10 p.m., which, by the way, I'm always supportive of as a psychologist, then they'll threaten that they're going to self-injure. But then they get their way because if I ground them or if I put any limits on them, any consequences for whatever unrelated behavior, then they threaten like, oh, you made me do this. No, I think as caregivers, parents, family members, that's a risk that we have to take. And remember, when it comes to non-suicidal self-injury, typically it's of low lethality and it's not a dangerous behavior, not life-threatening in the sense of it being dangerous. So it's okay to enforce a consequence and understand that it's possible that they might get really upset and self-injure, and we have to, it's not fun, but we have to be, that's one of the things that we're gonna have to learn to be okay with in order for them to stop self-injuring later. And I already mentioned before, they already know you don't approve. If it was so easy to stop, they already would have. There's no need for us to tell. I think it's appropriate though, as family members and caregivers to say, I don't like that you're doing this. I would rather you come to me, and it's really uncomfortable for me to know that you're doing this to yourself. I don't like that you're doing this, but I'm here for you, and we're going to get through this together, as opposed to, like, I can't believe you do this to yourself. I can't believe you do this to our family and all, and putting our family through all this. Like, that's what not to do. And I also referenced earlier, we've all done things that we know in our lives that are not in our best interest. So I think if we can honestly reflect, especially like some of the behaviors that have been self-harmful in a way that we've all engaged in at some point in our lives that we're not proud of, that can keep us more level-headed and empathic toward those who self-injure, that it's not in their best interest. They know that, we know that, but we've also engaged in things that are not in our best interest, no matter how perfect we seem we are. And we've done it anyway, right? And so yeah. Point number 8, manipulation, attention, and power struggles. Oh, I hear I earlier mentioned getting, self-injuring to get attention. But I want to talk a little bit about manipulation because I hear this in hospital settings, people that are inpatient or even medical inpatient. They self-injure and the staff will be like, oh, they're just manipulating me, or they're just being manipulative. I've heard therapists talk about their clients and patients that they see in therapy saying, oh, they're manipulative. They're manipulative. If I could take that word out of our vocabulary in psychology, I would, because actually I don't think outside of being physically coerced and made to do something like you're in danger and being forced to do, you can't manipulate someone. I know there's a lot in pop psychology talking about narcissism and manipulation and gaslighting and all, but still, so manipulation, I just don't like that word. One, if someone were to call you manipulative, how would you feel? Two, it's inherently pejorative, meaning by nature, it's just a mean, judgmental term. So calling anyone that, obviously, is pejorative and mean, judgmental. Three, research shows that we cannot infer intent of someone else's behavior. We can guess as to what their behavior and why they're doing it, but we can't read their minds. We don't know. Unless, one, they just said, yes, I truly did this to try to manipulate you. Okay, now we have evidence. But we can't infer the intent of their behavior accurately without them directly telling us. If we just infer this, that's just speculation. We're just speculating at this point if they're self-injuring to manipulate. Fourth, I know I have some young people in the room, so I'm trying to be cautious how I say this. A lot of young people aren't really thinking about that. They're just they're not putting all this thought into try to manipulate mom and dad or my teachers or my therapist by self-injuring. Some, yeah, maybe, but for the most part, none of us is really conniving enough like that to do that. And fifth, most importantly, if we talk about basic principles of psychology, there is no room for the word manipulative. I like to use this example of anyone that has had a parent or has had a child. You're at the grocery store, in the checkout lane at the grocery store, maybe some of you kids are in the room, and you're there's always that candy bar that you want, but for the little ones, the parent says no, and then the kid throws a tantrum. So what does the parent do or caregiver do? No, yeah, it's not rhetorical. Yeah, please do respond. Well, they buy them the candy bar, right? Yeah. So you're better than most. Props to you. But for the rest of us, we're more inclined to be all right, I'm embarrassed. Let me just give in. I'll just get them to shut up. So they buy the candy bar, and the kid stops crying. The toddler, like my son, will stop crying. But the child learned something in that moment, whether it was conscious or unconscious, that if I throw a big enough tantrum, I'm going to get this candy bar. So the next week, same thing at the grocery store. They're in the checkout lane. The parent says, no, you can't have one. And then they throw a tantrum, and the parent's like, no, they hold stronger. But then the tantrum just gets bigger. So there's this huge scene at the grocery store. So the parent goes ahead and buys the candy bar, whatever candy that is. And this just kind of happens. And so two things happen, really, in that case. One, the parent learns how to keep their child quiet, unconsciously or consciously. But two, the child learns, usually unconsciously, how to get a candy bar at the checkout lane in the grocery store. If I throw a big enough fit, I will get what I want. You could call that manipulative. In psychology, we call that operant conditioning. Introducing a behavior introducing something that increases the behavior, or introducing something that decreases the chances of the behavior. So introducing something in this way, the candy bar, gets the child to stop, throwing the tantrum. But the child, it gets them what they want. So it reinforces the likelihood. So it's operant conditioning, B.F. Skinner, 1960s, for any psychology buffs in the room. But yeah, there's no room in psychology for the term manipulation. So I highly, anyone, if we call our kids manipulative, we have a relationship problem we need to really address. It's not the behavior, it's our relationship in that case. In the last few points here, we have body checks. Some parents, some caregivers take it upon themselves to do body checks, meaning after the kid is out of the shower, out of the bath, or their teenager is getting ready to go into the shower, they'll have them strip down to their underwear, and they'll check, or they'll just look in the areas, different areas to make sure that they haven't self-injured. In some cases that works. I'm not saying that it doesn't. I'm just saying a couple of other things could happen. One, that's so intrusive to have anyone like be looking at your body that closely and having it stripped down. I've actually, in one of the episodes, a friend of mine's daughter at school, they had her stripped down to her underwear to assess wounds. How inappropriate in so many ways that is, the school. But I would say it's also not the most appropriate for parents to do. And also, these kinds of behaviors, giving punishments, calling them manipulative, telling them to cover up, not realizing that, not giving them the credit for being able to resist urges, that instead of making you a safe person to talk to about this, in order to stop, maybe they want to be able to be in recovery, you become an unsafe person for them to be able to. Instead, they start self-injuring, what I say, push it underground, like pushes the behavior underground. We ask them, Annie, when was the last time you self-injured? Oh, it's been so long. In reality, it was this morning. But we have to hide it so we're not shamed because of it. So we don't want to push the behavior underground by a poor reaction. A lot of people hide sharps. For some people, that can be helpful. If you're a caregiver in the room that is wondering, like, well, they have thoughts of self-injuring or even suicide. When it comes to hiding sharps, I mean, it's so hard. Like, it's so easy to find. It's so hard to stop that kind of cutting because you can find anything in pretty much anywhere you want to cause tissue damage. As simple as your fingernails, right? Or just somewhere on the ground to cause pain. So it's hiding sharps. We talk about safety planning first, when it comes to suicidal thoughts and even non-suicidal self-injury like this. But that's one, I think is most effective if it's in line with the young person's goals. If they say, yes, please lock away the knives because I'm tempted to do that, lock away the knives, put them away by all means. But having a plan together, so there's that communication and it's an agreement, I think that's where it's going to be helpful and useful. Next, validation. I hear so many parents say, oh, I understand this, I understand you feel this way, I understand you feel this way, but, which basically undermines and invalidates the very validating statement they were saying as far as I understand. So I suggest stop saying I understand and start demonstrating it by using language that reflects what truly their experience is. Like, I've noticed you've had a lot of rough time, it's been really rough for you the last few weeks, for whatever reason, bad grades or loss of a friendship, a family member, or just, moving away or someone moving away. So I understand you feel sad. It's like, we can do that by saying, like, it sounds like you feel sad, or it sounds like you feel worried. I'm wondering what, you're most worried about. Or you're getting ready to go back to school. Oh, you have nothing to worry about. It's like, okay, like, I understand you're worried, but there's nothing to worry about. It's like, well, that closes the conversation. So instead of saying I understand, start validating by saying it sounds like you feel sad. Is that correct? It sounds like you're having a tough time. It sounds like you're really angry at me. Like, okay, Or it sounds like you're self-injuring as a way to cope and it's working for you. That's actually a statement of validation. That's not endorsing the behavior. It's not condoning it, saying it's okay. It's just acknowledging. It's like, you're having a rough time, self-injury is working for you. I want to understand, I want to understand, help me to understand what it does for you and how it works for you so I can support you instead. And then when we're exploring that and asking them what it does, use a respectful curiosity. I think I talk about like not calling them manipulative, not saying not using punishment. What can you do? You can be respectful, be curious. Like you would with a friend, like, oh, what's going on? Like, I want to understand, help me. Like, oh, so you've been cutting, when was the first time? Like, so get ready, because I know as caregivers, it's really hard for the first time to hear this kind of information. But ask the right questions, be respectfully curious, and get therapy for yourself. People that don't think they need therapy are typically people that need therapy, and also those that say that they don't need therapy is probably because of stigma, not because they don't need it, but because they feel ashamed if they got it, what it would look like for them. There's no shame. Those days are over. I think we should get over ourselves in that case. I'm a psychologist. I've been to therapy. There's like no shame in that. This is hard. If it's a loved one, get therapy for yourself. And lastly, this is good timing. Lastly, if I talk about not, shaming someone, and hearing me say all these things, you're like realizing maybe you've done some of these things, and you're like, oh, now I feel shameful. No shame. If you've done this, these are all common things that many people have made mistakes with. If I could drive home one point it's not on here intentionally. That's if you've made this error, any of these, if you've realized, I could have responded better, it wasn't the best way, I was really, even as a friend, my friend told me that they self-injured, or it's my daughter, my son, or my grandchild, I could have done a better job responding. It's okay to apologize and have a do-over. Acknowledge it. I know many of us come from a generation where our parents did not apologize to us. It's time to apologize. And whenever I talk to parents on this topic, the last couple of times I spoke to the parents of our patients, our adolescents in our eating disorders program in Plano, just north of Dallas, about this topic, and I also spoke to parents of young people in Miami at Nicholas Children's Hospital, formerly Miami Children's Hospital, and I've given this advice, like, if you blew it, own it, apologize, have a do-over, do better. And I've seen parents actually, well, I haven't seen it, I've heard the stories, because after I spoke, they've come back, that the parent went and apologized, the kid wept, it restored their relationship, they were able to reconcile, and it was a huge step into overcoming and recovering from self-injury rather than continuing the behavior. So yeah, the power of an apology, I think, is just so understated. Here are some recommended resources. Those websites there, they're in the handouts, are the best websites. Back in 2014, there was a study that looked at websites that had information on Google, and nearly every single website had perpetuated at least one myth about self-injury. These ones don't. These are the best of the best. Those ISSS.org is the organization I'm a part of. Those top three are the cream of the crop. Here are a few books that I highly recommend. Healing Self-Injury, that first one, that peach color, is a really good one. And I put the Oxford Handbook of Non-Suicidal Self-Injury up there. It's not out yet. There are some chapters that are available, but it's going to be a huge resource. I don't know if it's going to be probably pretty pricey, so I don't know if your libraries have access to it if you're in school. Oops. And I wrote a couple chapters for that book too. So there's there's some of my content in there too. So it's kind of neat. I can't wait to see that. And then there's the podcast, and then you can follow me on Instagram, Twitter. You can follow ISSS, the International Society for the Study of Self-Injury, on Twitter and Facebook, and I'm typically the one posting on those. So, so that's kind of what I wanted to share. I know it's a lot probably to take in. I saw some head shaking, I saw some dozing off, and so it's hard to know the audience who I'm talking to, but I would love to answer any questions for the next 20 minutes or so. Yes? Over time, there's nothing wrong with buying your child a candy bar. I'm just kidding. That was just for people that, yeah. Yes, good.
So in the validation situation, the validation being the candy bar, isn't it dangerous to always just validate these things? Isn't there some form of lighter way that you want to show them without necessarily validating them? It seems like the goal of psychology nowadays is just to infinitely validate everything that happens with children, and some people believe that to be potentially dangerous. Where do you draw the line between validating them and helping them see something better? Or how to go about that?
Yeah, well, in this case, to my point earlier, they already know that it's not. Did you want to have him restate the question for audio or for video?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Okay.
You can summarize it or shorten it, but just restate it. It's
Okay. Do you want me to? I can just restate the question.
He'll restate it. Yeah, don't worry about it.
Okay. So the yeah.
One more after.
Okay. So the question was related to the candy bar and the checkout lane and validating, and how culturally now, isn't it, there's a lot of psychology, just validate, regardless of the behavior. I think there's a difference between, I think behavior change will only come once it's validated, once the struggle is validated. So people aren't going to listen. Actually, there's a sermon at our church this morning that was just talking about how I can't remember exactly. I have it in my notes right here on my phone, but usually people are not going to be receptive to anything that's anyone wants to say unless they've been validated. So that way they know they've been heard. And then you want to talk about behavior change. Okay, I'll trust you with that because you acknowledged my challenge, my struggle. You didn't make assumptions, and so I'll hear what you have to say because I feel like you're ready to listen. Because most of the time people are not validating. I think maybe what you're referencing is this kind of what I've seen in pop psychology is this everything goes as long as you're happy. It's like, well, like, yeah, as long as you're happy, okay, we could do as many drugs as we want. I'll feel happy doing that. Things that are happy, make us happy, aren't necessarily always what's good for us. So I very much agree with that. But
Thanks for validating.
Yes. And then we'll get to you. Okay.
Sorry, one last question. When you're giving these talks and stuff, especially in more conservative circles, do you ever run up against people that do not trust the field of psychology because the American Psychological Association's seeming missteps recently where they've kind of been usurped in a way, and maybe it's my own personal opinion, but I don't trust them. You know, the American Psychological Association says there's 89 genders right now and all these other things. So it's kind of like sad that it invalidates the entire field. Do you ever run up against, you're trying to help these people with this thing, and then you tout books and they don't trust the books for that reason?
For both reasons, on both sides. I think I remember when I was in grad school in Guantanamo Bay, there was a psychologist that was approving torture methods there, and APA got blasted for that, and I was stopped being a member then, and I am now a member of APA, and opens a lot of doors for me to be able to speak, and also there are a lot of people that distrust psychology simply because of bad experiences with therapists. I can't, just the other day, my wife and I were talking about someone who went to therapy, and all the therapist did was talk about themselves, and so it was really not a good experience. Or they say some really invalidating things, and it's really hurtful. So I think, there can be a lack of trust, and I don't, I'm a psychologist. I know the limitations of the field, but I feel like it's also given me a better understanding of the spiritual aspect too of being able to reach people. Tomorrow I'm going to be pulling out the Bible. I'm really excited about being able to talk to young people about self-injury in the Bible and Jesus, and so that's kind of a neat take that I feel like I get to have that I haven't heard before. Thank you. We have one up here too. Okay, but you can go ahead. You have the microphone if that's okay. We'll get to both.
I have a mic, so who knows? So can we address the biblical aspect of this? Because I think one of the reasons that a lot of people, myself included, take issue with modern psychology is because it leaves God out. And it leaves the biblical foundations out. And what we've seen over the last few decades is that without that moral compass, without that foundation, society is going every which way. And it includes cutting or self-harm. It includes, rise in suicide. It includes a rise in depression. It includes a rise in anxiety that cannot be controlled, that isn't controlled outside of medication, right? So, I would love to hear your take on it in a biblical way, because I think that without that, I can tell people, oh yeah, I'm sorry that you're hurting, but they need an answer. They need a strategy. They need a definition of who they are. They need mechanisms to cope with their anxiety and to cope with their worry and to cope with the feelings that they're having that don't include, harming their bodies, And without that, I think everything else is empty. So can you address that?
There's a lot to unpack there. I think there's like 2 or 3 things. I don't know if I can recall all of them. One of the reasons why I went into psychology is bringing a Christian understanding to it, and I was drawn to it. I like the quote. I forget who said it, but I prefer to light a candle rather than curse the darkness, to go into dark places and to reach people who might not otherwise seem to be able to be reached, to show them love, and to sometimes use psychology, but sometimes not. And I feel like working with young people, I wish, so many of them have had bad experiences at church. And so because of that, they no longer believe in God. And so I try to explore that with them, and then I go there, I have this little dance with them and try to get there and talk about where that stems from. At the same time, it makes perfect sense to me. And sometimes we want to offer a solution when it's not our role. And for me as a psychologist, it's not appropriate and it's not my role to proselytize or to evangelize in my office. Especially working with people that don't know the Lord, but I still can talk about because psychologically speaking, I believe we are psychosocial, biological, spiritual beings, and so I believe we have a part of our brain that allows us to connect with God. People say, oh, then that's because that explains why there shouldn't be a God. Is because well, for me that says there's got to be a God. Well, what God would create a being and not put something in them in order to be able to communicate with them. And so I feel like that's a God-given blessing. But for me, I've done missions. I've gone to Panama, I've gone to Peru, Mexico, I've many other countries. And but in my office, I see my role, because I work with so many people teetering on suicide regularly, is my role to proselytize, or is to get them to be a place where I can get them to be alive, to hear the gospel, so that they can make a decision in a space that they're cognitively able to make and conscientiously able to make. So, but I get that. There's a lot of grays. I deal in the gray every day. Most people gray in the black and whites, and so I'm kind of exploring things that people are. Our brains are if we think about psychology, just makes sense to do. We dichotomize things, either or. It's just efficient. Our brain needs to move quickly to make decisions. We don't have time to think about the gray areas or the middle ground. But that's where a lot of the suffering in life happens, and so I'm there. But yeah, I get that there's a secularization of psychology, but I'm in there working with young people using psychology, but also using biblical principles in my work, knowing, trying to meet them where they're at, that recognizing, I would love to be able to talk to them about the saving grace of Jesus Christ, which I'm get to do tomorrow, and I'm excited about that. But yeah, so I think with self-injury in the Bible, again, people know it's not it's not healthy for them. No one goes in there being proud that they hurt themselves. And so I try to, again, take a more of a gentle approach and validating approach in that, and then once they feel heard, then the guard is down, and then they're going to hear what I'm going to have to say. Yeah, so I'm getting a sense of anti-psychology in the room, but hopefully my responses are helping with that. I'm not I'm a psychologist, but my worth my identity is a psychologist, but it's not wrapped up in the American Psychological Association. Just like in politics, same thing. Yeah. We had a question up here.
I've been a public school educator since 1994, so I've seen a lot of transition. It seems like in the 90s we had more drug use in the schools. In the 2000s, it was just a lot of different things, not as much as in the 90s. But it seems like now this cutting thing has kind of just been thrown in our laps. And it really hasn't been identified. I see kids that have scarring. I see kids that have confided to me about that they do it. But as a public school educator, we have a responsibility that kids are harming themselves and we have to report it. So then it goes into a situation where then there's a trust issue because now we're not a person that they can trust. So I don't know if you're going to acknowledge that or you're going to tell us how to deal with that in the public school so that when kids are coming to us about it, how or what resources that we have for them. Because it's happening.
Oh, I know it. Yeah, I know it's happening. I've had kids inappropriately sent to the emergency room because they've self-injured in handcuffs down the hallway when they just went to this school nurse for help. And so and I hear that kind of happens. Are you going to be there Wednesday? Are you? Okay. I hope you signed up for this because I'm going to talk about a school protocol, but being able to differentiate what is a behavior that does require parental notification, because people are like, oh, we have to. Well, sometimes if maybe the parent is not a safe person and there is no CPS law saying that we have to, in that case, it's suicidal risk. And so we're not talking about those at risk for suicide. But we do know that this behavior does increase risk for suicide, attempts at least. And so we don't want to just say, oh, it's not related, but there is. But yeah, I'm going to be talking more about that on Wednesday. and I'd be happy to talk more.
We need strategies, we need like, something that tells us how to acknowledge it, because
Yeah.
we have training in that part, how to acknowledge it, because if a kid says, hey, I've been doing this, and then they say, well, I didn't do it for the last 5 minutes, then you go, okay, well, that's great.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, I have some publications. Yeah, so there's a whole a SOARS model I published. I'm going to be sharing with the school staff and recommending protocols to be able to have like a response team or point person for this, and like a very strategized method separate from a suicide response protocol. Yeah. But that's a legit concern. Yeah, I see this in schools all the time. Yeah, it is. Yeah. I saw there's a question over here, and I thought I saw another one. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm missing this. I don't know if anyone on that side of the room.
So during that last question, I was thinking about the element fed largely by social media, which I think is why maybe it's more heightened now than other times, where the contagion aspect, or like echo chambers where you learn tips about how to hide things or do weird stuff. And so I was trying to formulate a question about that, and then I thought, let me back up even more. And from your perspective, everything that you've learned about this topic and these individuals who struggle with this, just maybe off the record, not as a psychologist, just you as a person, like, do you have any ideas on how to lay a foundation preemptively so that a child or an adolescent, a youth, doesn't take this route?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. And I mean, we know that peers are important, but more than anything, a good solid relationship with parents is a protective factor for so many things, including self-injury. In fact, we did a study actually looking at data out of the university, not the University of Minnesota, but the state of Minnesota, with some colleagues at the University of Minnesota and Florida, and looked at like peer influence versus parent influence, and found that parents have a bigger role in protecting against self-injury than even peers do. But to your comment and question related to social media, I did a study at our hospital. We had an inpatient psychiatric program for adolescents. A couple years ago, for whatever reason, the hospital closed it down. But a number of years ago, I asked 90 or 96 young people, all with a history of self-injury, about their exposure to self-injury in the media, whether social media or traditional media. So this was the days before TikTok. TikTok, by the way, is also like brings up a whole nother issue of things that I mentioned a little bit in the most recent podcast episode. But what I found is that simply when a young person who self-injures is exposed to a new method of self-injury through traditional media, whether it be movies, music, TV, books, or social media, name any of the social media platforms you want, they are at risk for using those very same methods. They report using those very same methods to which they were exposed in the media. And the more frequently they were exposed to those methods, the more frequent they use those very methods. Now, it wasn't what we call longitudinal studies, so we couldn't follow over the time what happened first and later. So it's possible, because we captured in one moment, that those they had already self-injured, and so they just sought out that content and then read and then engaged in it, or did they happen to just be exposed to that content and then engage in it? We don't have that data. It's really hard to get in that context, being able to do retrospective thinking back. Like, most people can't remember what they had for lunch yesterday. So asking a teenager what they, when they first started self-injuring, when they saw it online, did it influence their own? But yeah, there's one interesting finding though. So being exposed to cutting in the media did not influence their behavior, their self-injury at all. I believe it's because most people, when they think of self-injury, most people in this room would probably have heard of it, and that's why you're here. What comes to mind when you think of self-injury? What method? Cutting. Yeah, and so simply being exposed to cutting doesn't. But what was interesting, those who self-injured, the more frequently they were exposed in the media to cutting, the more frequently they actually did engage in cutting. So simply being exposed to it didn't increase their likelihood of self-injuring through cutting, but being exposed to it regularly, frequently, did. So that was kind of an interesting finding. But trying to think of the last part of your question.
Well, primarily, you mentioned that parents can have a stronger
Yeah,
impact than
yeah.
peers, but like, I guess how? You know, like I'm sure every parent in here is concerned that's, you know, they have an attitude of compassion for their children. They want the best for them. But like, how do you bridge that before it is a problem?
Yeah, this kind of goes back to that validation question too, because many of us were just told, you know, stop your crying, I'll give you a reason to cry. You know, like, I'm pretty emotionally healthy and self-aware, but you know, not a whole lot of, you know, not everyone is necessarily, and I think when it comes to working with young people, like kids don't come along with like an instruction manual, like how to raise them, right? Like I'm finding that out really easily with our 2.5-year-old, and so I think like for every child is different temperaments, and it can be really challenging. And so being able to validate their feelings, whether you agree with them or not, and being able to help them label that and teach them. So just as they don't come with a manual of how to raise them, they don't get a manual of how to deal with their emotions. Just as like we have, you know, when it comes to brushing teeth, you know, like we know how to brush our teeth, we learn that early on. Same thing when it comes to, you know, taking, you know, good care of our skin, using sunscreen, or going to our regular checkups, our annual physicals, and getting medical care. But when it comes to therapy and psychologists and the mental health, like the aspect, we got nothing. Like there was like no guidance, and so I think parents, of course, grew up without that guidance, and may start saying things that their parents had said, and just because they say it, and just kind of like my comment earlier, like apologies are just like unheard of. And I think apologizing to our kids, validating how they feel, like my son, like I'm sorry, like I know I see you're angry right now, I'm sorry, but we can't watch more TV. Like put that boundary, put that limit. Bam, he knows that, like, all right, he knows I'm angry. He's not thinking through this, but what I'm doing is raising him in such a way that I can validate, like, it's okay to be angry. There's no wrong with it. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to cry. I remember when he was saying, like, no cry, Daddy. I'm like, well, one, I wasn't crying, but two, it's okay. It's like, and making it sure it's safe. Like, when people are emotionally safe, we talk about basic needs being met, throwing some psychology in there. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, what's at the very bottom, the basic needs are food, water, shelter, clothing, and the next up, then we can focus on safety needs, and then until those are met, we don't really care about anything else, including our psychological, emotional health. So once we get those basic needs met and validation, then we can actually reach like more healthier, self-actualized versions, like, you know, healthier versions of ourselves. But
When I hear interesting psychological studies on abnormal behavior and different things like that, I've heard them compared to, interestingly, the Amish communities. Have you looked at any of these behavioral patterns and seen if they're occurring in the Amish communities? Because typically they're not, and maybe there's something that can be drawn from that, whether obvious or not obvious. You know what I mean?
yeah, that's a great question, because I think there is a cultural element to a lot of things, eating disorders, for instance. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Fiji studies, that in Fiji, eating disorders were basically non-existent, and then they introduced television. So once they introduced television, suddenly afterwards there's this spike in eating disorders. So there's a cultural element to that. And then if we think about self-injury, though, this actually spans like races. We don't know for sure the Amish community. I haven't seen any studies. I haven't asked, but I bet that there are some young people and adults that self-injure in the Amish community, because most of the time we don't suspect. I have a colleague who's really like an expert in the field way before I was, like well beyond, and she works a lot with schools, and was approached by schools in the Middle East, like, oh, we don't have this problem. And so I was like, well, just humor me. Let's like do a survey, anonymous survey, and sure enough, the like rates, like prevalence rates of self-injury in those countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, were actually higher than some of the prevalence rates in other parts of the world like the US. So when we don't think there is, I would bet, because it's always been around. I mean, if we look at it in the Bible, it was even in the Bible. So it's like just always been there, and I bet in Amish, but I can't say for sure because we don't know the data.
That'd be really interesting to figure out. Maybe they're like hitting themselves with the butter churn or something like that.
Well, I know we're
Ethan, yeah, thank you. If excuse me, Yeah, and I know if you've got a few more minutes, I just wanted to
Yeah.
say that we said it was going to go to 7. If you need to go, you're welcome to be excused. But if Dr. Westers has a few more minutes for a couple more
Yeah,
questions,
I'll
we
stick
can.
around. Yeah, feel free if you need to go. Thank you for coming. You're welcome to hear and wait. Yeah.
Yes, sir. So I know that you're speaking to the public school community on Wednesday of this week, and I thank you for coming to Lampasas. And this is an interesting topic that really no one ever talks about, the non-suicidal self-harm. I wonder what your advice for me as a homeschool director. We have 583 families in my homeschool group that we started 10 years ago this month. How I can, as a director, in leading the group and other parents and students, what you suggest for me, what resources. I mean, I instantly went in and linked those resources, but anything that you can give to me that I can share with others.
Yes. So, and this is relevant for you. There is, as part of the, a part of the International Society for the Study of Self-Injury. It's called ICSES, ICSES, International Consortium on Self-Injury in Educational Settings, I think is what it stands for, and they have a lot of resources. But I think one thing, just beyond self-injury in general, I think is important when it comes to talking about just mental health is prevention work and providing education and how people can cope with just typical stressors or difficult stressors throughout life, teaching them at a young age, elementary school, to be able to have the psychosocial emotional language to be able to articulate their thoughts and feelings in a healthy way and deal with them. So I think that's one of the recommendations I would typically make. And so basically making it part of not just so focusing on just self-injury, and you'll hear on Wednesday when I talk about like addressing it as a whole, like a wellness as a whole. And I think self-injury can just be one aspect of that within there. We want to make sure like being able to be emotionally healthy regarding depression, anxiety, being able to differentiate, well, what's typical anxiety, what's abnormal, it's like anxiety, with sadness versus depression. But as far as, I think there's a ton of resources on the ICSES website, which I think is, you just look up ICSES, and I think it might be .org or something, but yeah.
One last question.
Yeah, last question. Well, I think they're going to have the audio recording, or the video recording, Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so April's question about giving us biblical references. I know you have to stay neutral in your office. A lot of us have to stay neutral where we work, things like that. Can't talk about politics, can't talk about the Bible, all that stuff. But we're in a church right now, so here we are. What do you have for us biblically that we can use in raising our children?
A lot of things. Where do I start? Just as child psychologist, be nice to our kids. I think I know we laugh about it, but how many of us, when we reflect on our childhoods and our parents, how nice they are or were, especially when we struggled? Were they supportive, or were they saying just get over it, like buck up, pull yourself up by your bootstraps? I did it. I got out of bed and went to school. Why can't you? So expressing understanding, empathy, compassion, being kind, and recognizing that when the Bible talks about raise our child in the way they should go, it's not always in the way we think they should go, but what God says they go, and maybe they're hearing God's voice a little bit differently than what we think. Maybe a different profession, different career choice, different state, different city. And I think when it comes to like self-injury, if we look at Jesus, he didn't focus on the behavior. He went straight to the heart and brought healing. He didn't sit there and say, stop doing this, stop doing that. He brought hope and healing. He didn't worry about comparing us versus the world, what the world would do, what he didn't do. He just went, he showed love, and he brought healing and freedom. And the reference for that is Mark 5:5, when you look at the one time in Scripture that specifically talks about cutting, and it's actually a demon-possessed man. It's in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but not John. And Jesus went to the man. He was cutting himself in the tombs. He was demon-possessed, and the man who was demon possessed actually came out to Jesus. And so that's one of the tips I'm going to talk about, for the young people tomorrow is to go seek after Jesus. And Jesus never sat there and said, you got to stop doing this. You got to, how dare you cut yourself, or you're demon possessed because you're doing that. No, he just cast out the demon, and the guy was healed. And then he left. He was kind of pushed out because the people there lost much of their livelihood with the swine drowning in the in the bank. But I think a lot of that is many times we feel, and I see this a lot with my brothers and sisters in Christ, saying, well, in order to be loving to them, I have to tell them the truth. One question I ask, what have you deposited in the relationship in order to make that withdrawal? To say, this is the truth. It's like, I'm being loving to them. It's like, you don't know them. We don't know them. We just go and we judge their behavior by what they do instead of getting to know them. And Jesus was all about relationships. And I think that's how we share love to our young people, our kids. And instead of shaming them and telling them that's not the Bible, that's not what God says, we hear them out and then direct them and guide them. A lot of parents, I think, like to cite, with the Psalms where it says, spare the rod, spoil the child. The word rod, if you look at the Hebrew, is also a word for shepherd's rod. I don't know any shepherds beating their sheep, with a rod. They use it as a hook to kind of guide them along. And a lot of parents, they'll use that and it's like, well, that's my right to, for corporal punishment to spank them. And I was spanked, growing up, but we know from research that's just not useful, not effective, and if anything, it can build resentment and an unhealthy way of managing anger. So I think being able to question our assumptions about what we believe, what we've always been taught, and being able to actually look deeper in some of the scriptures that we flippantly use, and more just really learn and then think about how we can apply it in a way that Jesus would, in a loving way, and not just use the term, well, I'm just being loving, but actually being hateful, I think, because we don't have that relationship. And I think with parents too, you heard me say depositing without making a withdrawal. I think about that with emotions and our children's emotional bank account. Many times we try to withdraw that which we haven't deposited yet, this quality time, the time that we spent, the love, the care that we want to spend with our kids. And then when it's time to hit on something very serious, they know that there's enough love in that bank account that we've deposited that they can trust us, or that they will trust us, and then we can bring that to them and make that withdrawal. But when we're trying to withdraw from a bankrupt account, it only ruptures the relationship and can cause more damage. And I'm going to get off my soapbox now. I'm just talking. So thank you for having me, everyone. Hope to see some of you tomorrow.
Yeah, and just want to remind you, there's a lot of resources in the foyer on that center table. Thank y'all for coming. Again, remind anybody that you know that has youth to come tomorrow and see Dr. Westers. Thank y'all. God bless you and have a great night.